there was, I think it was probably about 10 years ago that they were talking about putting cholesterol medications over the counter, but I've seen way too many side effects from the use of the statins.
Yeah.
In fact, I think that they should be regulated better. Way too many people with rhabdomyolysis. I've seen way too much of that, so it's a good thing it never did go over the counter.
Oh, thank goodness. Now, like, how did pharmacies obtain medications back then? Were they just from, like, the...
You had a primary wholesaler.
Wholesaler? Okay.
A primary wholesaler, and you didn't have a contract like most pharmacies do right now. Most pharmacies now need a contract to protect the cost of their drugs. There's no way that the wholesaler was going to give you an advantage in your buying, and then because the government got involved in paying, they became the main payer or the third-party payer. They wanted their cost to be based on your actual cost. And if you were able to buy directly, there was direct buying from the manufacturer where you would have an additional cost savings, and that would be part of your profit margin. The government wanted their cost to be based on what your actual acquisition cost was.
Mm.
And I think that's AWP.
Yeah. Oh, so they made it a little more complicated.
They made it, well, they had a really big footprint because they were the main payer, and then they controlled everything. And now even the doctors have to cave to whatever the insurance companies want. Before that, I can remember in the late 70s when the insurance companies made a lot of demands on the doctors. There was a lot of doctors that pulled up stakes and left the state.
What was it like having to deal with the insurance companies back then? I imagine it's pretty annoying now, so I imagine back then it might have been.
Well, that was one of the main abilities that would qualify you as a better pharmacist than another pharmacist. In your ability to know which questions to ask and when to ask them with the insurance companies, how to get the correct answers so that you could solve a problem. A lot of people went round and round, and I watched them. You know, they're just asking the wrong questions. They just didn't know how to do the dance, is what I call it. You know, you had to know how to dance with the insurance companies, and they had to, you just have to know what the rules are. If you want to play the game, you got to know all the rules. So knowing the rules when you went into the situation, whatever the rules that the insurance company required that you fulfill, if you knew those, then you knew how to cut your workload instead of beating yourself against the wall.
Did you find that it affected the trust of patient or your customers at all? Because I know nowadays you get a lot of people, when the insurance is denied, they like to yell at the pharmacist and blame the pharmacist.
They do.
So was it the same back then?
Well, it's never changed. I mean, if you didn't have rapport with people, if you weren't a people person, you wouldn't be able to tell the patient in the proper way that, you know, I'd be able to do this, except I'm being stopped by the insurance company. But if you were able to dance with the patients, or if you were able to engender confidence, they would trust the things that you were saying. And it was really important to me, and I got berated by this when I worked for big corporations, in going the extra step in the patient's behalf with the insurance company and making the additional phone calls to get the job done. And like I said, I got in trouble a lot of times for the amount of time that I was spending trying to make one thing work for the patient.
Yeah, so they're talking about patient advocacy. I know they try to be very big on that and instill it in us. Did they try to teach you guys that in pharmacy school?
That was a seat of the pants
Just,
thing.
yeah, just kind of learned it on your own, I'm
I
guessing?
did learn it on my own, and that came from the community pharmacy setting where people trusted you more than you really wanted them to trust you.
And I know, like, we're taking, like, communications classes as well, but
It's a good idea.
yeah, so
It's a
you
really
kinda
good idea.
went on your own on that as well, kind of learned on the
Whenever I
fly.
went to interviews, I often told the people that were interviewing me that if I didn't go into pharmacy, I would have went into the circus.
There you go. Natural born performer then, huh?
It's not so much a performer. The circus people they go there to have fun.
There you
So
go.
all you do have to do is engage yourself with them. So engaging with people was one of the things that I really enjoyed about pharmacy. It was the people.
Yeah.
It wasn't so much the science. It was the people. And every 5 minutes you got another person. And then again, like I said, I got in trouble for my engaging of the patient population where I was supposed to be filling prescriptions.
So they were strict about that back then too, huh?
The bigger the company, the less time they wanted you to spend with the patients. They wanted the technicians to be the interface for the pharmacy, and I didn't believe in that.
That level of lack of knowledge and things like that.
It's not so much the lack of knowledge, they just didn't have the people skills.
Okay. Now, did you join any organizations or anything once you became a pharmacist? Or?
The local professional pharmacy, Western Mass Pharmacists Association, and they've since changed their name to something else, but that was the only association that I joined.
Now, excuse me. You said, let's see, did you dispense a lot of compounds and things like that, or?
In the early days, there was a lot of compounding. This was coming over here and anticipating this interview. One of the biggest things, or that we did then that you don't do now. I mean, if you get a compound prescription order from a doctor in a retail pharmacy, you're just not going to do it. You're going to send them someplace that does it. When I was working, I would try to comply. A lot of times the ingredients or the doctors were writing for, so you would stock it and it would be on the shelf until it expired in order to make one prescription. So, but there were compounding pharmacies that locally that you could direct people to. But there was a lot of compounding in the early days. There was a lot of it.
Now, you said originally patients, or I guess, when the third-party insurance companies and the government things started stepping in, about what time was that? Like what year?
That would have been the early 80s when I guess it's called Mass Health now, whatever. The state was the one that took the initiative to control the costs of the drugs. And as soon as they did that, then the insurance companies saw that they could apply the same pressures that the government was applying. So they fell right into line, and whatever changes that the Massachusetts Mass Health was applying, the insurance companies were right behind him.
Now, before that, though, patients would always pay cash. And
Well, the pricing schedule was not dictated by the either when the government became the biggest third-party payer. that's when the changes came, and like I said, it was in probably the early 80s that they became a real monster, and but it was insurance that the people never had.
Okay.
So there was an advantage to the people that were getting health care that they wouldn't have gotten before because of the cost. But along with that came the big-handed application by the government about price control. So
Okay.
that's where the profit started to disappear from pharmacy, and it was no longer feasible to operate as an independent. You had to have volume in order to exist, and you couldn't do it as an independent. There just wasn't enough population in a given area. One of the things that we learned in later pharmacy in Mass College was that you'd have to, if you wanted to operate a pharmacy, even as a portion of an arm of a chain, is that you had to have an immediate population that could access you. So you weren't going to put a CVS out in the Berkshires, in one of the small towns like Shelburne, where there's only the population of 1,000. You know, you'd have to have a high concentration of people in order to support any type of pharmacy.
Now, when all these rules and regulations were being placed on you guys, did the pharmacists all join together and try to fight and try to advocate for themselves, or?
Well, there was, you couldn't. It was illegal.
Really?
Oh yeah, it was the collusion was the word that they used, and it was, the laws were based in the antitrust laws. So if you spoke to another pharmacist about let's get together and let's do this, prison time, if they could prove it. So
It's pretty intense.
it was intense. So you were, from the very beginning, you were inhibited from working together against the system. The system controlled you, and it was way back in, I forget what the antitrust laws were, but collusion was the word.
Now, when you switched to the hospital, what hospital did you work at?
Ludlow Hospital.
Okay, and about how many years did you work there?
I worked there for 2 years,
2 years, okay.
and
Was it a big hospital? Or
it was small. They were lucky to I think they had 175 beds, and they were lucky to occupy 100 of them at any given time.
Oh, how long would a patient usually stay in the hospital?
Some of these smaller community hospitals were usually the last stop. Most of the patients were really, really elderly, and most of the conditions that you saw were they were age related, and the morgue was busy.
Was it tough, a little depressing maybe, or?
Well, they tried to keep it quiet. For the most part, most of the patients, they didn't see the activity that was going on. And if they were moving a deceased patient, they were really considerate about, exposure to that type of thing to the other patients. And they still do that, I'm sure. I mean, they're not going to move a gurney by, people with the sheet over the face.
Yeah. Now, that was around the third-party insurances and things covered most of the costs?
That was one of the beauties of moving away from retail pharmacy, is you had no exposure to the insurance companies. Yes, you would have to do the purchasing through the wholesalers and be responsible for the cost of your inventory, but you didn't have to deal with the payment for the services or the drugs. That was awesome.
Did you guys have a formulary set up for the hospital, or?
In that particular hospital, we did not have a formulary, as I recall. The doctors were back in that time, and that was in the early 90s, the doctors were still pretty belligerent about we're the boss and we want to call the shots. Doctors don't have that authority anymore, and they've learned how to play the game. So it was later on that, in other hospital settings that I was exposed to formulary. And the doctors still wanted to write outside of the formulary, and you'd have to call and talk to them and says, this just can't happen. Let's do it a different way. And after a while, they welcomed the call because they didn't have to memorize the formula. They would just rely on, sending through the wrong order, the doctor or the pharmacist flagging it and then making the call to the doctor. And they enjoyed the fact that the pharmacy was giving them input and they were covering their back for them.
Now, we talk a lot about checks and balances of procedures in hospitals and things. Did you guys have any drug delivery procedures that you had to follow, like protocol or anything?
Yeah, everything was by the book. Everything was by the book, and the closer you got to operating by the numbers, which is what we did in the military, you would avoid the heartache of errors or mistakes. But you're talking about ordering drugs, inventory, management.
A little bit of everything.
A little bit of everything, yeah. Record keeping. I was lucky to work in settings where everybody wanted to put in over 100% of the effort. I don't know if that had to do with my ability to create rapport with other people. Some pharmacists found it really difficult to be team players. And then the work setting got to be really difficult. Yeah. So people's skills are still really important in pharmacy, even though most of your pharmacies are closed shop, and the pharmacist himself is not allowed to have a face-to-face with the patients. Yeah. The counseling laws, I think, were a good thing, and it forced a lot of these pharmacists that would hide behind the bench to go out and expose themselves to, questions that the patient might have. A lot of the students, you've got to have the eye contact while you're talking to people. That's the thing, to talk to them until you know that they're listening. And then once they're listening, then they have the questions, as soon as you can open them up.
Now, in the hospital, where exactly would the pharmacy be located?
Always in the cellar.
In the cellar?
Always. Always in the cellar. When I was in a pharmacy that had a window, it was just so awesome. Most of them were almost like a dungeon. Yeah. Always in the cellar, and always really bleak.
Yeah, kind of depressing.
Kind of depressing. Like I said, you had to work with your co-workers in order to make the environment workable, because they shoved you in probably the least valuable floor space in the building.
Now, did you guys have any kind of technology or anything back then in the hospital, or like anything to ensure that the correct medication was given to patients? Or
patient profiles were on index cards.
Index cards, okay.
And the labels came out of a computer that was an 883, an 8083. I don't know if your computer information goes back that far. And they were on 5 1/4 discs. You ever remember seeing a 5 1/4 disc?
I do remember those, yeah.
Okay. So that was the only technology that we had, was the label. The patient profiles were all handwritten.
Did you have that kind of technology in the pharmacy that your father owned, or was it all handwritten?
It was all handwritten, and it was all manual typewritten labels.
Now, did you guys, were the standard sterile protocols any different than they are nowadays, or?
Way different.
No.
Way different. When I entered, there was almost no, when you're compounding something, it was usually a topical application. So sterility was, cleanliness was important, but sterility was not. Antibiotics were liquids that you just shake and pour, or pour and shake, or whatever. So internal compounds were almost non-existent.
Now, excuse me, I know you talked a little bit about the medications and things, but like hypertension medication and things. So, excuse me, I guess that was the main diseases and things that you guys had to deal with. I know you said in your
anti-anxiety, Valium was the big drug. That was the biggest drug. Anti-anxiety. We were joking that, you know, if you got a female patient that did not have a Valium prescription, it was the oddity.
Wow. Now, did you guys face any drug shortages or anything back then, or?
I wasn't involved in any. I'm trying to think of pharmacies that I was in that had one. There was one incident where there was a bottle of Tussionyx missing. I'm trying to remember how that was resolved. I'm not going to go into that, but it was, luckily, and that was one of the big things. You wanted to make sure that you ran a tight ship as to your inventory and your control of the controls. And then having the paperwork to account for all of the stuff that you, and it hasn't changed that much.
I know now, like, the government comes down and checks all the C2s and things like that. Did you guys have anything like that? Or?
Well, we didn't have all of the reporting requirements then. Counting the inventory, way back, we didn't do the counting. We had to keep, I forget when they first initiated the continuous inventory control recording. We just had to keep the C2s in a separate file and stamp the 3s and 4s. Of course, that was before they had the 6s, so that the 5s were, you know, your non-abusive drugs. And then they became all of the exempt. There was exempt narcotics at the time. Do you remember those?
I think so.
Tylenol number 3 was an exempt narcotic. You had to keep a signature log. Robitussin with codeine. All of your codeine products were basically over the counter, but we had to keep a log with the signature of the patient. And then they became the 5s, and all of the other drugs that had no abuse potential became the 6s.
Okay. Now, while working at the hospital, were you ever on any of the boards or any of the committees, or?
No.
No. Well,
No.
Do you know if they were any different than they are nowadays, or did you have anyone tell you any experiences of it, or?
I didn't have any experiences, but as the hospital pharmacies evolved, the clinical pharmacist is the one that was responsible for that type of input with the interface with the rest of the administration, or the medical staff or the administration was the clinical pharmacist's forte and their job. Staff pharmacist was still just a staff pharmacist. And I personally didn't want to go anywhere beyond that. I'm not good at politics. I'm only good with people.
There you go. Now, for the when you said the clinic, you learned more about the clinical aspects of pharmacy in school. When you went to the hospital, was there anything that you kind of weren't prepared for, or that surprised you about working there? Or
I wasn't so much surprised as I was eager to overcome any of my deficiencies. Working under the hood, preparing sterile products, I had a good instructor. And so that had a lot to do with my initial breakthrough, or I've been lucky all my life. I've been a lucky person.
Now, did you feel like when you went to the hospital, maybe you had less of an impact on patients than just talking to them every day at the community setting? Or
Well, in the community setting, you had people that came to you because you were who you were and they trusted you. In the hospital setting, you lost that patient contact. And personally, I needed to be a service to someone. So the nursing staff became my direct contact, and the patients themselves were almost a third-party situation. It got to a point where, yes, I would initiate an awful lot of interaction with the nursing staff that the other pharmacists, again, would not.